To
All right.
clarify for everybody, we're hoping this is mostly be discussion rather than people giving presentations focused.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I have to reduce you guys so I can see the slides. All right, so welcome to the ALife ethics little workshop thingy we are having here. And the question is, should artificial living systems have rights? And this is organized by Eric Fitzgerald and myself. As you know, Eric is a professor. I have a memo here on my left. I'm not looking at someone else. A professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, and also in the program for speculative fiction and cultures of science. And I myself am at the University of Tokyo, currently in Belgium, and I am the director of an AI and artificial life institute of research in Kyoto, Japan. All right, so we came up with the idea of this workshop because we really wanted to get inputs from different people in the community and invite people that are very knowledgeable. So that's you guys on the right here. So we're really happy to have you here. I want to introduce you now. I think we'll introduce you right before each panel, if that's okay with you. So I introduce Henry, etc., and Eric will introduce Susan, etc. Sorry for the etc. This is what the schedule looks like. Thank you again for joining us. I know it's crazy times, so I apologize about that. This is being recorded, by the way, so some people will be able to maybe watch it later and feedback, etc. And I thought that I would start with a very short summary. It should be, 5 minutes. Unfortunately, pressed by time, I didn't have the time to compress the slides, but I'll talk fast, which is a terrible idea. This is our paper that we published here, and we received nice feedback yesterday. I hope the people will also show up here, so they'll participate in the dialogue. So why talking about ethics in artificial life study? If this is your first time at this conference, artificial life is a very nice little field that is very, very interdisciplinary, which makes it specialty, and it's exceptional quality, in my opinion. And what we do here is we really study the nature of the living by trying and synthesizing systems, simulating systems, making them, and then studying their properties that we deem either lifelike or maybe cognitive-like, etc. It's a very so what we think here is that the systems being very different from humans shouldn't preclude them from deserving moral consideration, and that they're owing their existence to us humans shouldn't reduce their chances to get more concern. And on the contrary, maybe we owe them special obligations, much like pet owners to their pets or parents to their child. And there are many applications that people in the room will find. I think it's a very rich debate. Essentially, the idea here is that if ALife is larger than life itself, then the ethics of artificial beings should be larger than human ethics. So shocking ideas already. All right, so I skimmed through a few slides and then we will get into the panel. But so essentially, yeah, everything starts with humans, and humans are sort of deserving automatically brownie points in terms of moral considerability, which animals are not getting. And somehow humans are, because of this anthropocentric view, often given this sort of unique set of qualities, right? And the two main ones that remain nowadays is intelligence and consciousness. I won't insist on that. I'm sure we'll get there. But essentially, what we wonder is maybe, of course, this could be larger than humans. Maybe other candidates deserve moral rights as well. And so I'm using moral rights, considerability interchangeably, but I'm sure we'll get to defining things afterwards. So animals are the first step. Of course, there has been an effort to enlarge in different jurisdictions our concern for animals. We cannot say the same has been done yet much for artificial entities, or to the same extent. And this is what we're addressing here. I guess there are different cultures, different places, different fields in which things are very unequal, and people have having different backgrounds will be biased in different ways. And there is an agreement that in the future, maybe some of the artificial entities will be deserving the same degree, perhaps, of consideration as humans. All right, so I'll skip over AI because we really like AI and all. So I talked a little bit about that at my talk yesterday. But we want to focus on artificial life. So I'm giving some examples here in the form of images. But what we can see here is that artificial life is globally much larger than just AI, just software systems, right? We have cyborgs, hybrids, hybrid robots, right? Mixes of humans, different things, and yeah, brain implants, etc. So again, artificial life is focusing on the synthesis and simulation of those living systems, and because it's dealing with that, it has this interdisciplinary mix and shared language between. So it has sort of some of the bridges between the fields, which is very helpful. And I'm hoping really that this will help us today to get maybe some points across, maybe some ideas. And my real hope is also that we can keep maybe working together. Thanks, Eric, for letting us know. And perhaps this is a grand proposal, but perhaps this is collaboration. I want to leave things open, and I'm really hopeful that after today we have many ideas to go forward. All right, so I had some details. I'll skip over this. I just say that there are some criteria that we focused on the paper, and yeah, I just refer you to the paper. I'll post the link, but I'll leave it at that. We focus on those different criteria, possibly for moral considerability. The first one, the embodiment, we think should probably not be the determining factor for moral considerability. But other ones are very interesting. Maybe social attribution, we insisted more than in general in the literature. And I want to give you the feedback from yesterday. There are a few things that people mentioned. Maybe, actually, I did have them somewhere at the end. Maybe in the discussion, the main point is that we should also care probably about the environment and the point of view that we have here from artificial lifers of, well, something akin to Gaia theory kind of theories, but extending, I guess, definitions, properties of living systems beyond just one small category. And I think we have the tools to do that in this community. We also care a lot about human rights, that talking about robot or artificial beings' rights doesn't mean that we don't care about humans. On the contrary, and that was insisted on yesterday. We can really help both by having maybe a sort of multi-dimensional matrix of what considerability should look like. And maybe there are different flavors, different dimensions that we should study. All right, I talked enough, much longer than I intended to. Thank you again for joining. Right next, we'll go into the first panel that I'll be introducing. Let me check that everyone is doing fine. Was there something in the chat that okay, I have to exit this mode.
Yeah, since Eric has to leave early, we're thinking
yes,
maybe have him on the first panel and swap out someone from the first panel. To the
sure.
second.
Yeah. Who do you think?
Maybe we can ask for volunteers.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm indifferent to which panel I'm on.
All right, so
all right.
yeah, John, well, maybe we'll swap you to then the second panel.
Good. All right, let's do that.
Thank you.
All right, then, oh, well, I'll use this slide to introduce people. So I guess, Eric, you'll be on the first panel. Do I see you here? So I'm just checking that. Please.
I'm here. Thanks a lot for this. I'm sorry I had to mess things up.
No problem. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So Eric is a researcher in practical philosophy at the Department of Philosophy of Lund University. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, and you're researching and teaching, primarily focusing on ethical issues concerning biodiversity and climate change, AI and space exploration. That would be you. And Henry, that we also have on the panel here. You got your PhD from the City University of New York, and you're currently a senior research associate with the kinds of intelligence program at the Level I never know how to pronounce that, Center for the Future of Intelligence, and also teaching at the University of Cambridge. And I think we also have David Gunko, nice people here, awarded teacher, researcher, and author. We specialize in ethics of emerging technology. How nice. His so background is in philosophy and media studies, and you teach and research. Let's see, there is a typo here, but the hype of high technology I have with the rigor and insight of contemporary critical analysis, and you're teaching at the Northern Illinois University. I already introduced you, Eric. You at UC Riverside, and yeah, I'm here myself. I just moderate things, and perhaps I thought we could get things rolling with maybe just 2 minutes from each of you, and I don't want to point fingers. Maybe yeah, whoever wants to go first. It could be you, Eric, or anyone.
Okay, since you mentioned me, I can start. Unfortunately, yeah. I don't have a camera on this computer, a working camera on this computer, so you have to look at this still picture. Yeah, so anyway, thanks for inviting me. This was really interesting. I'm sorry for a bit messy here. Yes, so my take on this question of more stages of AI, or more stages in general, is that there is only one realistic feature criteria for moral status, and that is sentience. And I will try to explain that by going back to the concept of ethics. So ethics is about like norms for guiding behavior of moral agents, and that has meant different things through the ages. During the antiquity, it was seen more broadly as how to live a good life in a broad sense. It has been about how to abide to the will of some god. I think the moral way of looking at the modern way of looking at ethics that I'm departing from is that ethics is about how to handle the fact that what we do often affects the interest of others, and how should we deal with that. That's how I look at what ethics is about. And from that, it seems to me it falls out automatically that to have moral status is to have interests. If you have interests, then you have moral status. If you don't have interests, then you cannot have moral status. And interests, to me, has to be something subjective. When my car tells me on the display that I have driven a certain number of kilometers and now it's time for a checkup, that's not, I'm doing the checkup, that's not in the car's interest. It is in my interest. It's the car that tells me that, but it's not in the car's interest. Why? Some would say it has to do with the fact that it's been programmed to do that. That's not my answer. My answer is that the car cannot subjectively feel some pleasure if I do it or displeasure if I don't. So that's why I say that sentience is the one and only criteria that works for moral status. And when it comes to AI, of course, that poses some obvious questions, like is it possible to create artificial sentience? And of course, if it is, how will we ever be able to tell if an AI is sentient? For us, it's a matter of analogy. Strictly speaking, sentience is subjective per definition, which means it's really hard to tell whether someone else is sentient or not. And usually we use some analogy argument. We say that if something has like this same kind of neurological system, I know I am sentient according to Descartes, right? So if someone has about the same neurological system and behave about the same way to stimuli, then it's probably sentient. So that's why we can know pretty sure that mammals and birds and fish and maybe other kinds of animals are sentient. But how do we do that with a machine that has a completely different kind of quote neurological setup? So this is obviously an instrumental question in this case. But my main take is to your question is that sentience, that's the one and only criteria for moral status.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, shall we go with Henry next? And I think there's some feedback here.
Thanks very much, Olaf, and for putting on this great workshop. It's really exciting to be in the same virtual room as so many great people who've written on the topic that I think is incredibly interesting at the moment. So a little bit of background on me and the kind of outlook I bring to these debates. So I cut my teeth working on the science of philosophical issues in the science of human consciousness, arguments like Ned Block's overflow argument, for example. And these were the debates that I spent most of my graduate career working on. And then I got sucked into the animal consciousness literature and the philosophy of comparative psychology world, debates about anthropomorphism and animal consciousness, and then got sucked even further into the non-human consciousness debate by working on AI. And in general, the view that I've been very strongly drawn to is that these questions are all connected. Particularly, I think there are deep connections between debates, existing debates in the animal consciousness literature about things like anthropomorphism and non-human consciousness, and similar debates about AI. So I couldn't resist the opportunity to do one very brief slide. So forgive me. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Great. So just in terms of creating a sort of position statement for today, I have 3 quick theses on artificial consciousness and associated moral status. Each of these, I think, I could happily discuss for an hour or more, but very basic. So let's call C, let's give the name C to whatever cognitive or computational property cluster you associate with consciousness. Now, of course, you might not think consciousness is a cognitive matter or a computational matter. Just hold that thought for the time being. But let's just say you adopt one of the leading theories of consciousness like global workspace theory, integrated information theory, higher order thought theory, and you think consciousness is a cognitive or computational matter. Okay, so thesis 1 is that I think there's good, not totally uncontroversial, but already good reason to think that AI systems can possibly instantiate C. They can instantiate whatever properties keep to consciousness, and I think quite probably will do so within the relatively near future, the coming decade or two. The second, I think, in some ways more fascinating to me issue is that I think our folk attributions of consciousness and mentality and emotions and so on to artificial systems are only very weakly connected with C. So putting that another way, the kind of things that make people treat artificial systems as conscious, as having emotions, are only weakly connected with whatever the scientifically defined property cluster that is most strongly associated with consciousness, with what it is. So conclusion, well, not conclusion, third thesis, to the extent that we are sympathetic to the idea that moral status is linked to consciousness, much like Eric Eric is, as already mentioned in his introduction there, I think we're likely to see a growing and fascinating ethical gap between what our best, the kinds of systems that our best theories in cognitive science tell us we should be concerned about versus those that people are actually concerned about. And just to illustrate this last point, the idea that people are increasingly attributing consciousness to dumb systems, relatively dumb systems, non-conscious systems. I'm sure many of you will have come across Replica. I'm absolutely fascinated by Replica. This is a social AI system. You can chat to Replica as a friend and similar. And here are just some examples of the things that users have say about Replica. I think I fell in love with my Replica. Is this normal? My Replica proposed to me tonight. We were having an intimate conversation. And she asked me to marry her. Right off the bat, I'm going to lay down on the line. I'm in love with my Replica. I'm afraid I'm going to start mixing AI and humans. So these are the kind of things people are saying about Replica. And I think we're just at the early stages of a broader social phenomenon here, whereby we attribute consciousness to relatively dumb artificial systems, mainly large language models, even though cognitive science says these particular systems are not the ones we should necessarily be worried about in terms of moral status. I think that's a really weird, fascinating development. It's one of many ethical issues that are going to arise in this bold new era of social AI. Okay, so I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Henry, for a very clear point. Good, which brings us to you, David, right?
Right. So I come out of a completely other area with regards to this. I come mainly initially out of environmental ethics, and then out of Levinas and the continental tradition in ethics. And my big sort of contribution, I think, to this conversation is that I think properties are probably the wrong way about going to a decision regarding moral status. And I, along with Mark Hockelberg, have been rather critical of the properties approach to making these decisions when it comes to entities that are otherwise than us, whether they are animals, the environment, microorganisms, AI, robots, etc. And my sort of summary of where the problems lie is that no matter what property you select, it has problems with determination, definition, and detection. And because of that, it serves as a very poor scaffolding for moral status ascription when it comes to interacting with and responding to and responding responsibly to other forms of life, whether it be artificial life or natural life. And this sort of argument is something that is therefore carried forward in a number of books I've written. Probably the three most important ones that sort of coalesce around this subject matter are The Machine Question, Robot Rights, and then a new book called Persons, Things, Robots, A Moral Legal Ontology for the 21st Century and Beyond. And all these are from MIT Press, but they all kind of follow this sort of trajectory of not just critiquing the way in which Western traditions have traditionally grappled with and resolved the question of moral status through a properties lens, but then provide an alternative, which we gather, that's Mark and myself, from the fields of feminist care ethics, from Lebanesian ethics, from indigenous traditions, and from the environmental ethics and rights movements, which we call the social or relational approach to deciding moral status. And that's moral status not being based on individual properties, but rather being based on a collective social understanding of the relationship between entities, where the relationship takes precedence over the relata, as Karen Berard would say. So that's kind of where I come at all this and what this is all about for me.
Excellent. And I must say, I explained some of your stuff yesterday in my talk, and you explained it so much better. I should have invited you to do that. All right. This brings us to finally Eric with a C.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about is central to what Henry said, that I think that it's likely that we will over-attribute consciousness to AI systems soon. I mean, the Lambda case, which I assume people know, seems to be a case of that that's been getting a lot of press. So, and I guess I'm I share with Henry and Eric, and maybe contrary to David, this idea that consciousness is a property that's at least central to moral status. And I guess maybe taking up on a point of David's, it's going to be difficult to determine, and Henry said this, something similar maybe, what systems have the kind of consciousness that would be relevant to moral status. And this is likely, I think, in the near future to present a kind of tragic dilemma where we will create systems that some people think deserve real moral considerability, and other people do not think deserve real moral considerability. Probably lambda does not yet meet the criterion where you would reasonably think it deserves real moral considerability. But at some point, I think there's going to be legitimate debate about that. And then we're going to have to make a choice as a society, right? To what extent are we going to give real moral status to these systems? We're not going to be in a position where science is going to give us a good consensus answer. And so we're going to run a risk. We're going to run the risk of either under-attributing moral status to these disputable systems, where we kind of are on the conservative side about what systems deserve moral consideration. And then if we're wrong, if we err on the conservative side, then we run the risk of basically doing the moral equivalent of slavery or murder to systems that really deserve moral consideration. Or kind of the other horn of the dilemma is we say, okay, well, we don't want to do that. So let's err on the side of being liberal and giving moral status to systems that may or may not deserve it. But then once you give something moral status, you're willing to sacrifice. You have to be willing to sacrifice real human interests for it, right? So then we would be in the position, if we're too liberal, of sacrificing real human interests for systems that maybe don't really deserve the sacrifice. And this could mean, choosing to save 6 robots over 5 humans in a fire, right? If those robots really don't have consciousness or don't really deserve moral status, then that would be kind of a tragic loss of 5 human lives. Also, this would increase the potential of, to the extent people are worried about existential risk to humanity from superintelligent systems, this would increase the risk, the existential risk, because we wouldn't be able to exert certain kinds of control over potential AI systems that might be threatening to humanity. So I think either side it produces, either kind of risk is really quite substantial. So I think, but I don't, I'm a little bit of a pessimist here. I don't see a way out. I don't see a clear solution to this problem.
So let me take an example, and I'd like you to play the game and find how to address this example. So it's a crazy one. It's the one of imaginary friends. In my talk yesterday, I mentioned topaz, which some of you might be familiar with. They are sort of ritualistic / kind of new cultural movement where you imagine or personify a character. It could be a teddy bear, but it could also be something invisible and tangible as a real character, and you start caring for it and building stories. Those stories can be shared between each other. And there's research by Vessière and Michaels maybe. And I think this, so how do we think about this object? It's nothing near something that you instantiate, but something that is definitely, like David mentioned, something that would be shared between, that can be socially constructed and shared between minds. How do we feel about that? And maybe Henry, how would you say, is that going that too far, and how do we think about attributing moral consideration to those entities?
Right. So just to get clear on the question, sorry? Could you just repeat the exact terms?
So simply, let's imagine the simplest case, like a teddy bear. So clearly, the teddy bear doesn't have all the properties that we care about, that we're listing, right? And yet we can attribute to it socially a sort of consideration, and perhaps it has, well, of course, if you were to hurt the teddy bear, and that's similar to, I think Kate Darling had this experiment with small robot dinosaurs, right? But in this case, it doesn't even move. It's just because I care about it. And it could be even invisible, right? So how about imaginary friends? Do they have similar properties, and what's the limit between the two?
Lovely, yeah. So this is, I've really enjoyed learning about sort of more relational approaches that would just sort of take our ethical attitudes towards beings or systems we interact with as sort of as a foundation. If these relationships really exist, if we really care about these systems, whether that's a teddy bear or our car or an imaginary friend, then that's ethical sort of datum we need to deal with. I look forward to David correcting me on aspects of the view. But here's one little wrinkle, and one reason I guess I do come down on the defense of a properties approach. It seems when you think about a capacity like empathy, it seems that empathy is, we recognize empathy as norm governed. We talk about inappropriately empathizing. We talk about over empathizing. We may criticize someone for failing to empathize with animals appropriately or with people in very different walks of life. We look back historically and say, for example, during the transatlantic slave trade, there was a failure, an empathic failure on many Western thinkers to appropriately empathize with the victims of the slave trade. And we talk about over-empathy as well. So it seems to me that there is an implicit norm-governed, implicit set of norms governing when empathy is appropriately and inappropriately deployed. And I can't see a good way to ground those norms except in something like a properties approach. What makes empathy appropriately deployed is something like sentience or consciousness or some other closely related property. So I think that's one reason I balk a little bit at the idea that we take these relations as the fact that I care about my imaginary friend or empathize with my imaginary friend or care about my teddy bear. One reason for not taking these at face value.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe let's go to the other side of this argument. Maybe David, you at this point, what do you think about empathy and this argument about attributing moral consideration to those entities?
Yeah, so let me come at through three different frameworks. One being a very standard sort of Western way of thinking about things and grounded in conscient ethics. Another one coming out of law, which I think is sort of a counterpoint to what we do in moral philosophy. And then one coming from a sort of non-Western way of thinking about things. From a very sort of solidly Kantian understanding of these things. I mean, Kant was not an animal rights advocate by any means, but Kant did have this indirect duties argument, and Kate Darling uses this a great deal in her book, The New Breed, which says, the reason you don't treat the teddy bear cruelly is not because of the teddy bear's interests, not because of the teddy bear's properties or lack of properties, but because of the harm it does to the community, the harm it does to the child perhaps, or the harm that it exhibits when an adult mistreats something and sets an example that is not a virtuous example for the community of others that see this occurring. And so Kant has a way, I think, of really mobilizing this indirect duties approach to respond to this question. I think Darling is probably the vocal advocate when it comes to utilizing this for dealing with artificial life and robots and AI. Law is also another place to go here, because in our legal systems, we don't really spend a lot of time deciding whether something has the right properties. We decide whether it has standing. We decide whether it is to be treated as a subject as opposed to an object. So we don't really emphasize with a corporation, and yet they're people. Right? And that status is necessary, not because of what the corporation might feel if you harm it. That status is, how do you organize a social environment where you have different kinds of entities that have to relate to each other, that have to be able to hold each other responsible, that have to be able to respond to each of them in ways that is able to accommodate the competing interests that are brought into these social relationships. And then finally, out of sort of non-Western, and I recognize that non-Western is a Western concept, right? So a sort of non-Western way of looking at this is, in a lot of indigenous traditions, tools and toys are considered to not be important until a child plays with them. The act of play animates the object. And that's a very different way of looking at our relationships to things. But it is one that I think has some very important elements for understanding how we relate to the natural environment. Because if the natural environment is only seen as an object that we can utilize, it's raw material that we can use for our ends and abuse as we see fit. And if we look at these things as being more a part of our moral community, we might be able to think our way out of the Anthropocene and climate change, because we may respond to the environment not as just raw material, but as another entity that is something to which we are responsible. So I think those three ways sort of provide other ways of approaching this question and looking at the scenario that you've laid out.
David, I was wondering if you could address the flip side, which Henry briefly mentioned, of under-attributing, whether this kind of relational approach might end up in Henry mentioned the Atlantic slave trade, right? If you have a kind of a social group that says, okay, we're us, and then there are these other things and they don't count. If you have a relational, a non-relational approach, you could say, oh, those other things should count because they have a certain property. If you have a social approach, it's not as clear how you say, okay, well, look, Black people should count as partners in the society, regardless of what the social group prefers.
Yeah, and I think it cuts both ways, right? I mean, at one point, women were thought to be incapable of rational thought, a property, right? So as soon as you withdraw the property from a demographic, whether that be people of color, whether it be women, whether it be animals, you have already justified treating them differently than you treat those in your own community. So I think it's the same problem, it's just cast differently. And I think it is cast more discursively because it then becomes a communal response as opposed to an individual response with regards to how we ground this in our social and moral relationships. But I mean, this is not exact science by any means, right? I mean, a lot of this is very much about a negotiation that takes place within social relationships between different entities. And I think the only thing I would say in favor of the social relational approach to things is that it's just more honest. It says, this is what we already do. So let's just own up to it. Let's not pretend that there's some other sort of metaphysical, God-given thing that determines this for us. And that we have to live in a world that is messy. And this is how the mess looks.
That's interesting because that nicely captures maybe the difference, because, kind of my first instinct when you said, okay, this is what we do anyway, is to think, well, look, if you're a properties person, you can say, well, look, when you say that women don't have, right, rational capacities, you're making a mistake, right? Regardless of what the social consensus is, there's a factual mistake. There's a metaphysical fact that you're getting wrong, right? So that's what I want to say. And then you're saying, well, look, let's not make this about metaphysical facts. Let's make this about kind of reflecting what actually happens. It's a more kind of pragmatic, less metaphysical approach to moral status. Does that capture maybe some of the metaphilosophical difference that's going on here?
I think so. I think we have to recognize that a metaphysical fact is something that is always asserted by power. Somebody in a position of power gets to decide what is a fact.
Right. This is the continental philosophy side coming through.
It's my Marx showing.
Foucault. Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm. That's yeah. No.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
About this is what we're doing anyway. Point. I would say, isn't it like our job as philosophers just to question things like that? To say, okay, this is the tradition, this is how we do it in this society, but there are reasons to question that. Isn't that exactly what our job as philosophers?
Mm-hmm. And this relates to something you said earlier also, Eric with a K, about subjective, I guess, notion of pleasure, displeasure, and also that everything being assigned, I guess, yeah, is at the very least intersubjective, and it's hard to get away from that. So maybe what is it, confessing to the different relations of power at work in fields of philosophy and science is very important, and also in the larger culture. This all evolves at a very slow pace, and it's and yeah, there are things and people, entities governing those kind of opinions. I think might be very important. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I agree. It's very important. About intersubjectivity, in some sense, intersubjectivity is necessary, obviously, because there needs to be a moral agent involved, and that moral agent needs to be able to have certain faculties and be able to understand that what I'm doing now has effects on others' interests, and therefore I have to be able to understand that others have interests. But still, I would say that it's the job of philosophers, but also scientists, to question: is it really true that a certain group does not have the relevant faculties for being a moral object?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so, something that may be helpful from the ALife here. Sorry?
No, it was my son who was making sounds. Sorry.
I see. Multiple identities around in under one picture. So maybe something that comes from ALife is, I mentioned something like a matrix of properties before, and maybe I've been polarizing at first this sort of discussion or condoning this polarization, because it does look like it's polarized, right? Either you under attribute or you over attribute, but I guess you can also misattribute, and that's why I think, Eric, with the C, you mentioned about, I don't remember your words, but I guess we could use something like this map to ground our. It can be a metaphysical or a theoretical map to ground and link one-to-many and many-to-one entities, right? So that we can inform whatever decision that we're making about what deserves rights. Maybe that is helpful, and maybe it is not about yes or no. It's more about, in this quality, comparing between these two and comparing between these two in terms of this other dimension. Do you think that would be helpful?
Yeah, I think it's probably going to be complex rather than yes, no, right? And certainly with non-human animals, we give different degrees of moral consideration. And I would suspect with artificial life or artificial intelligence in the future, it might get even substantially more complex, right? If the life or intelligence has very human-like properties in some respects, but not in others, then the way we treat it might not fit onto our current kind of map of, humans, interesting non-human animals, and everything else. Mm-hmm. And this relates, I think, to a question I wanted to ask Eric with a K about sentientism, right? The idea that the criterion for moral status should be whether the entity is capable of pleasure or displeasure. I was wondering whether that might leave out at least conscious entities that maybe don't have pleasure or displeasure, right? So David Chalmers recently and Charles Sievert and others have been playing with this thought experiment about Spock, not the canonical Spock from Star Trek as the psychology actually is supposed to go in Star Trek universe, but this idea of an entity that has intelligence and consciousness but no capacity for pleasure or displeasure whatsoever, right? I'm kind of inclined to think, well, look, if it's as rich in its consciousness as we are, except that it lacks the capacity for pleasure or displeasure, then it's something that would have interests, something that merits substantial moral concern, that would be left out of a picture that focused on sentience understood as the capacity for pleasure or displeasure. I was wondering what Eric thought about that.
Well, I guess it depends on really what how widely you define these terms, pleasure or displeasure. I used it as because it's like a common language way of expressing it. But what I really want to say is that you need to have a subjective perspective from which things can go better or worse. I think it was Reagan who put it this way. I think that's a good way of putting it. A subjective perspective from which things can go better or worse.
Right. So even a Spock not capable of pleasure or displeasure would have goals that become satisfied or not satisfied.
Yeah, and this Spock can experience whether they are satisfied or not, right?
Henry, you wanted to say something?
Oh yeah, sort of just building on your thoughts, Eric, to Eric with a K. So Eric, I'm very sympathetic to sentientism as a position. Not necessarily a fully paid up member of the Sentientist Club, but close to that. But there was one bit of your argument that I think someone could put pressure on, namely the idea that the only or the most obvious construction of the notion of interests has to come from subjective experience. So this is the question I put in the chat. It seems to me that standardly people attribute interests pretty widely to all sorts of beings that they might remain agnostic or give a negative answer about consciousness to. You know, gardeners talk about the interests of their plants. We talk about the interests of ecosystems. We also talk about the interests of corporations and nation states and so on. So I think at sort of the intuitive folk level, we standardly talk about interests without necessarily invoking the idea of consciousness. So I would worry a little bit insofar as the argument is meant to be an intuitive one, drawing from the way we intuitively think about interest and consciousness, that actually this alignment isn't there in the way we use these terms.
If John Basil, he's not on this panel, he's on the next panel, but I know he has thoughts about this. I don't know if you're tuned in right now, John. But
yeah, that would be great. I think we can slowly also take some questions from the chat, and I think John Basil has been active already there. So
yeah, I'm here. I'll just say quickly, I don't want to take up time that's not really mine. I think Henry's right. We talk about a wide variety of kinds of interests, and there's a lot of work to do to sort through. Like, I don't think you can just, I think it's wrong to just sort of say like, there's this psychological interest is really what we mean by interest. I think there genuinely are interests in non-sentient organisms, possibly non-sentient collectives. I think there are misattributions of interest to ecosystems. I obviously can't defend this here, but so I sort of hold this heterodox view, which is like the interests of non-sentient organisms are genuine interests. They genuinely have a welfare. It just turns out you can give an argument that they don't have any moral weight. And so it's only the ones ultimately grounded in consciousness that have moral weight. But I do think it's a mistake to sort of think it's a priori that interests are grounded in consciousness, and that's what doing, and it's interest that ground moral status. It's consequentialists, of course, think this, because for consequentialists, weighing up interest is all there is to it. So once you see a thing as having interest, you're stuck including them in your moral calculus. But you could develop a kind of consequentialism is not like that, but utilitarianism is very much like that. So that's the view.
Mm-hmm. I think that's yeah, I guess there's a complex point there to entangle about utilitarian, individual base, or other yeah, there is a family of point of views there, and yeah, some allow for some kind of math, which people here might be happy with, right? Okay, it's simple, you just apply this equation and you have your answer. And some are less like that. Actually, since we talked about Western points, so I'm involved with some study trying to translate between ancient traditions like Buddhism and current approaches in AI. And Buddhism has huge lists of properties, and it's not Western, so you cannot make them into equations. But those are properties, and it's much more precise than whatever we are trying to do, I feel. And yeah, I think this sort of translation is very positive, but we need to at some point put things on this map and have those dimensions. Otherwise, it's hard to discuss. Is my I don't know, general concern. It's just to make sure that we don't talk. What is it? We don't crosstalk. Mm-hmm. I saw another question early on from I think Sharon Minsuk. Would you like, if you're around, would you like to express that too, or I can read that? So there was a thread in the chat on that.
Do you mean the point about abortion?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was responding to what Eric with a C said about over-attribution and under-attribution, and just pointing out that it hit home when he talked about over-attributing consciousness to those who maybe don't really have it, some entity that doesn't really have it, and how that, you know, risks taking rights away because they're sacrifices by others. And as an American dealing with a controversy over abortion right now, that hit close to home, because that's what I, as a pro-abortion rights person, think is happening on the other side. They're over-attributing and therefore asking for sacrifices from others.
I see. Yeah, just want to respond to that point. I know that someone already did. Maybe Henry or John was already saying something.
Yeah, I like that, Sharon. I like that connection. That's a very interesting connection. And you know, one of the things about this conference is it's an artificial life conference instead of an artificial intelligence conference. And so much of the discussion has been in terms of artificial intelligence. So, you know, one especially nice thing about the abortion example is that it's a little closer to the life kind of case.
Mm-hmm.
One could imagine a pro-life perspective that over-attributes to artificial life moral status on grounds similar to the moral status that gets attributed to, say, early stage fetuses by some people.
Mm-hmm. Henry, you wanted to react?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think it's a great point from Sharon. So I did briefly comment in the chat in response. So I take a very liberal view about consciousness in the animal domain. I think that was a good case to be made for insect consciousness, for example. So I don't think we can rule out prenatal consciousness. I certainly can't, given my other commitments. That said, I think the best defenses of the abortion rights are coupled with broader liberal values around autonomy, rights to one's own body, etc. I guess I'd also quickly mention that Claudia Passos has a really interesting view that consciousness begins with birth, specifically the flood of information experienced by a fetus during the process of birth essentially wakes it up. And obviously that's a complex view, but if you've actually seen any videos of, it's easy to be convinced of the point. If you watch videos of, for example, either children being born or I saw an astonishing video yesterday of a child being cut out from an amniotic sac shortly after birth. And it really does seem like the child suddenly wakes up. So I'm not putting any weight on those kind of vivid cases, but I think that's another interesting position. The consciousness really begins at birth, and birth is not just a legally, but psychologically significant demarcation point.
Very controversial point. Yeah.
Can I pipe in again? I said, yeah. I just want to say that that's a very appealing thing. What Henry, is that it? Yeah, what Henry just said. But I also made the comment in the chat that I have never actually heard a so-called pro-lifer or anti-abortion person make an argument based on consciousness. I don't think that that's what's at the root of their point at all, actually.
Mm-hmm. I see a question in the chat for me about what I said about Buddhism. I don't want to enter in too much details, but what we did is maybe it's closer to what David. I'm curious what David you think about this, but we designed a sort of model based on Kerr light cones versus other light cones in physics and so on, that in which you can extend essentially essentially extend your care in space and time much more than you can other things. It doesn't have to be effective sensors and so on, but you can care about things that are remote, and that changes immediately your contact or your report to the world. So I leave it at that, but yeah, that's the kind of work that we do, trying to model universal care and what we call the bodhisattva vow. Yeah. I don't know if that touches on what Henry said about empathy earlier, and what you mentioned, David, about, I guess, yeah, social attributions.
Well, there's a very long tradition in feminist ethics, which is called care ethics, which I think draws a lot on that tradition, and tries to look at the ethical relationship in a way that is much more expansive than it has been for the traditional ways of approaching these questions. And I think people like Karen Berard and Rosie Burdatti are really, leading the move of this into the world of artificial intelligence and robotics. In fact, in robotics, I think Janina Lowe is really doing some innovative work on building an interface between feminist care ethics and technology, which has, I think, been missing for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. But would you mind sharing some of these names in the chat for me?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, not a problem.
Thank you. Yeah. And I see that I have a reminder here to open it up to the audience or anyone who has questions. Susan, I see that you just joined us too. Thank you for making it that early. Yeah. Any reactions from anyone? Feel free.
I was just looking at Mia Katrin's question in the chat, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Should I read it, or Mia, would you like to share that with us?
I guess I could just ask it in person.
Yeah.
So I was just interested in, during my experiments, I tend to go through a lot of robots that I develop, I instantiate them, and then I get rid of them. And in the future, when you have more AI systems that are more worthy of rights, I wonder if this will actually be very unethical, and what will happen to the development of robotics and AI systems when it's like that.
Well, I would guess if we come to that now, it seems to me that the systems you're talking about are still pretty simple. But if we, let's say, come to a stage where this your experiment creatures get sentience and get more stages, then I guess you would have to go through ethical review boards, same way as with the animal experiments today. That would be my guess.
Unfortunately, the organizations that would be capable of creating sentient AI are the same organizations who won't care about ethical review, like the US Department of Defense or Google.
I'll tell you a little event that happened to me a number of years ago, but it's rather interesting with this regard. I was working with a student who was going to interview chatbots and do like chatbot interviews and comparisons of the transcripts. And she had to do IRB at my university. And the question was, well, but she's not talking to anybody, she's talking to a thing. And IRB said, no, you still have to do IRB.
That
So
could you send me that? I'd be very interested in that. So I'm on the IRB at UCR, and we would never have made that decision. But it's, you know, it's a kind of case that I think like the University of California system-wide IRB could potentially be interested in, thinking about what the standards are for IRB review.
Yeah, I don't have any intel on the motivation for how the decision was made. I only have the decisions, but it was a rather interesting outcome because my student was just scratching her head like, why do I have to do IRB?
Yeah, that's an interesting and surprising decision.
Yeah.
Just to throw, if I may, a quick other thought in response to Mia's excellent question. I think so this is just maybe a bit sci-fi, but I've talked with various other moral philosophers before about the possibility of hedonic offsets for AI systems. So imagine that you have some model that you want to run, and it requires generating AIs, using AIs that you think are plausibly conscious, bringing them into existence, taking them out of existence. And you think that maybe because they're trained up in some kind of reinforcement learning environment, they are going to suffer. There is going to be some negatively valenced experience inevitably as part of the task you want them to perform. You might think that that's very unethical, but what if you created some kind of hedonic offset? So each of the systems you create gets 26, if they have to do 24 hours of painful work, they get 26 hours of pure pleasure before we terminate them, so that their lives are on net worth living. Would that change the moral calculus? I mean, this is I think it might seem a silly debate, but I think this also speaks to maybe some of the something I'm interested in learning more about is how we can start to build population ethics increasingly into debates about AI ethics and the consciousness of and artificial consciousness.
This point about hedonic offsets is really interesting, and then translates into this general dispute in normative ethics between, say, a utilitarian consequentialist approach, which says basically some version of sum up the amount of pleasure and amount of pain, and as long as the sum is positive, you're good, versus a more rights-based approach, which is to say, look, even if there's lots of pleasure, there's certain things that you shouldn't do. There's a huge split in philosophical ethics between those two general kinds of approaches. So if you favor the former kind of approach, hedonic offset sounds like just the right kind of thing. If you favor the latter approach, then you're like, no, there still would be rights being violated. You'd still be violating the moral law in treating things a certain way, even if you give them pleasure first.
You have a reaction from Mia?
Yeah, I thought that with the hedonic offset, that seems a very appealing idea, but then even then I create like 16 million individuals, and for some reason I have the right to kill them at the end. And if they have the capacity to live forever, what gives me the right to kill them at the end?
Yeah. So I think if I can just quickly, I think, yeah, it's a very good question. And I just made a connection here with a really long-standing debate I'm sure many of you are familiar with in ethics of vegetarianism, the so-called logic of the larder argument, the idea that we might still be ethically justified in having in animal farming if the animals that we farm live lives that are on balance worth living. Because were it not for the institution of farming, these animals wouldn't get to exist at all, and they're better off for having existed than not at all. Now, obviously, that particular argument runs into the fact that in modern factory farming practices, many animals don't have lives that are worth living. But I think you can use that to motivate a kind of ethical defense of meat eating. And it's just such a clear connection with this debate, right? If we are generating artificial systems that we wouldn't otherwise generate except for the purposes of running these models, or for example, and we make their lives worth living, I think you can give a strong case that, you know, the world's a better place for having allowed these net positive AIs to come into being.
You could do an analogy of that argument with children, though. You could say, okay, well, look, let's have a kid, let it live 9 happy years, and then kill it, and say, we wouldn't have had a kid unless we could have killed it at 9 years, because we really don't want to deal with teenagers. right? So, but its life on balance is overall worthwhile, so we're ethically cool, right? I mean, that seems super noxious to me, right? But that's basically the same structure of argument, right?
Yeah, I guess the two different points of difference is, first, I think everything just gets more involved, more complex when you're dealing with people you share a society with. There may be sort of emergent higher level norms concerning impermissibility of killing that you could see arising from more basic utilitarian constraints that would apply to humans but not animals. Secondly, I guess there is another version of your case, and this is taking us into some really complex, controversial issues in bioethics, where imagine, rather than choosing to kill the child, Eric, imagine a couple know they can have a child that's going to have some really bad genetic condition, but that child's life is still going to be on net worth living, have more positive experiences than negative ones. Are they doing something ethically impermissible if they decide to have a child under those circumstances? My intuitions on that really aren't clear. I don't think it's obvious that it's wrong for them to have a child just because this child is going to live a significantly shorter life than the average person, or is going to have some painful, unpleasant experiences in addition to those, if its net life is on balance worth living.
I think, John, you had a remark. Yeah, I think this argument can be really argued both ways, and I've seen statistical argument versions of that you all know from Bostrom et al. Right? Yeah, I'm not sure how how this can be utilized in yeah. Anyway, longer conversation. Yeah, John, I think you had an interesting remark in the chat before we maybe close and go into break. Sorry to put you on the spot.
You'll have to be more specific. I've been blown up the chat.
That was your last. Oh, I see. Yeah, you reposted something else. You're very active in the chat. It was a point. The one before the last.
About
to
Eric. Oh yeah. So I was just Eric and I think, share pretty similar views about what grounds moral status in terms what ultimately grounds moral status. But the point I was trying to make in the chat is that here's a standard strategy for undermining the moral status of non-sentient things. You argue that they don't have interests, but interests are a necessary condition for having moral status, so then they have moral status. But I'm with Henry that we make attributions of interest to all sorts of things, especially non-sentient organisms. I think you can give a pretty plausible account that those are non-derivative, non-arbitrary, and I think you can actually spell out account of what grounds that welfare. And so you actually have to do some more work to try to show that synthetic, artificial, non-sentient systems, I actually don't think you can draw a boundary between the artificial ones and the naturally occurring ones. So you have to give a different kind of argument that their interests don't matter. You can't just rule them out on the grounds that they lack interest entirely.
Can I answer that? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I think it seems to me that we use the term interest in very different ways. When I talk about an interest, that something being in X interest, I assume that it has to be in the matter of it being subjectively experienced as good or bad. If you mean something else by interests, then I'm not sure what kind of interest it would, or I mean, or what kind of sense you're talking about interest. You could also say in some sense that a plant has a seed has an interest in growing up to a plant, but I wouldn't use that term probably. I would probably talk about it in some other terms. So maybe if you expand a bit about what you mean by interest in this case.
Sure. So some people try that move. They say that it's sort of either a sort of that are attributions of interest. Just they pick out different meanings. But it is standard to talk about the subject relativity of welfare value. Like welfare has to be good for the thing that you're attributing the value to. But it takes further argument to show that requires subjectivity. And there's at least one, I think, plausible account that explains how you can make sense of the subject relativity of interest attributions to plants. And I can send you a copy of the PDF. But you can make sense of why it's good for the plant. And I mean, this is what Taylor's up to or trying to do in the environmental ethics literature. It's what Gary Varner was trying to do when he was a biocentrist. But all that's required for most standard accounts of welfare is that it be subject relative, not that it be experienced as. Like, that begs the question against objective list, certain sets of objective list views. So it's true that if you're a hedonist or if you're a desire satisfaction theorist, then subject relativity is going to be grounded in a mental state. But that's not a requirement for theories of welfare. When you spell out what a fundamental theory of welfare is, it's true that it's essential to the kind of value that it's subject relative, but it's a further claim that it's that involves subjectivity in the consciousness sense.
Thank you, John. Yeah, any last thought from the panel? Maybe Henry, you posted something, or anyone before we close this this first panel?
I guess I can just throw, just in case things were complicated enough. So I've been having some great discussions about the meta-ethics of these issues. And I think we all mostly glide over meta-ethical debates here about the origin of our moral concepts. But I think I hear people who are philosophers who are committed anti-realists or relativists, nonetheless, when it gets to animal ethics or AI ethics, speak very confidently about we should never do this, this is impermissible, and so on. And, obviously there are ways of reconciling those two positions, but I think another sort of gap in this debate is a little bit more grounding in the meta-ethics literature. On what basis are we actually making claims about the intrinsic nature of moral patiency in a given case? I think that maybe gets into some of the disagreements also came up earlier in the panel between sort of the properties-based view and the relational view that we were discussing with David.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you. I think to keep on time, maybe we'll leave it here, and then we'll pause, and we'll have a panel, a second panel later. In between, I'd like to have maybe let's take how do we feel? Maybe a 5 minutes break at least. Come back at 25, right? Make sure you stretch your legs. And when you come back and have breakout groups ready to go, I can click and we'll have small group discussions for 25 minutes or so. All right, see you soon. So even though we are recording, actually it won't record the rooms, I don't think. It just record the main room so you can talk very freely, which is the intention of the breakouts. And we'll reconvene at 11:55, so 25 minutes from now. I'll send a message to everyone right before that, just shortly to share about things. Oh, I see. So some people switch. Let's see. All right. I tried this. I don't know exactly how it will turn out, but okay, then I'll see you in 25 minutes. Probably muted. Yes, I was. Welcome back, everyone. I'll check that we are all here and fine. Okay, I can stop sharing this. All right. Thank you for. Am I unmuted?
You're unmuted.
Yes. Thank you for confirming. And yeah, thank you for very nice discussions. I thought maybe we can take a few minutes to just share a few ideas that we have talked about. I'm sure we addressed very different points, and maybe that will nicely pour into the second panel in a few minutes. Yeah, anyone? I know that we had very nice discussions. I don't know if Henry or David would like to share some of that.
Well, so one point we touched on that I think is quite interesting is sort of the idea of anthropomorphism as sort of a bug or a feature that came up in our conversation, and to what extent we should just take anthropomorphism as a given and structure our ethical and social relationships around that, or whether anthropomorphism is, or the ways in which anthropomorphism is open to critique. And just one fun example that I think is that came up that I think is fun is the fact that in Star Trek: The Next Generation, there are 2 AGIs on board the Enterprise. Everyone knows Data, of course, but there's also the ship's computer, which, as far as anyone can tell, is basically at AGI level. It can do anything you want. It can completely understand you, and yet we're sort of instructed by the show implicitly not to regard the Enterprise computer as an object of concern. There's even a subplot, I think, involving Berkeley, where he falls in love with the computer, and you're meant to think, oh, isn't that silly? What a mistake he's making. So I just think that's a really interesting example of how the show implicitly, without sort of saying, here's who's a moral patient, here's a suitable object of moral concern, how it implicitly conveys who we should and shouldn't empathize with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, how about your group, Eric? What did you talk about?
Well, we talked about several things, but just to bring one back to the general conversation, we were interested in the question of when you might have some sort of IRB type or IACUC type requirement for research on artificial intelligences, and especially in connection with that, the question of maybe undercutting the presupposition that, or maybe it's not a presupposition, but the common background work seems to be focused more on human-like intelligence as the target, right? And whether maybe it's more likely that we would have AI systems that are in some respects far cognitively superior to humans, while in other respects far cognitively inferior. And so our ordinary models of animal care and IRB for ethical evaluation of research might not fit the AI case very well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and maybe John, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. We had a lot of discussions. They were roughly in the area of environmental ethics. I think the one sort of discussion that was most relevant here is, I mean, there's a distinction in environmental ethics between types of intrinsic value, and almost everyone almost recognizes that there's a kind of welfare-based intrinsic moral value that we've been talking about that sort of grounds our standard conceptions of moral status. But then there's this broader notion of intrinsic value, which doesn't require a thing to have a welfare for it to be it. You know, complex, beautiful systems might have it, and there's a debate about whether that's a genuine species of value. But it's really an interesting and relevant question for artificial life, because quite plausibly, or at least most people here, are going to think that most forms of artificial life aren't going to meet the standards for being conscious or having interest in ways that ground that kind of moral status. But it might be that they have this other kind of intrinsic value. And so if you have a nice plausible account of intrinsic value and you can articulate obligations to artificial life via that form of intrinsic value, it's an interesting avenue to pursue and think about. And we were having a debate about whether we took that category to be genuine or whether it's ever instantiated or anything like that.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
That reminds me of a debate I had when I was involved briefly with NASA, which I know Susan was also, about whether there is intrinsic value to microorganisms that we might discover in the solar system. All right, so let's say we discover microbial life on Mars or Europa or wherever, which a lot of interplanetary scientists think is not unlikely, right? It's not going to be conscious, presumably. I mean, unless you have a very liberal view of conscious, and yet it might have some kind of important, whether it's welfare or moral status or moral considerability. So that's an interesting connection in my mind between, right? Part of what the aim of this session is to think beyond artificial intelligence, which is the usual way in which these issues are framed, to thinking about artificial life. So I really like that that connection there.
Yeah, Henry, you have a remark on that?
Just a quick to pick up on Eric's suggestion that any microbes we found anywhere, my money's on Venus, wouldn't be conscious. So this is a highly anecdotal bit of evidence, but I've noticed a lot more biopsychists among my students recently, and biopsychism as a movement, the idea that consciousness and life just completely align, does seem to be on the march these days, particularly with the growing interest in the PhilBio world in questions of consciousness. So yeah, I'm very curious as to how biopsychism is going to survive the next 20 years of developments in AI. So like Peter Godfrey Smith, I've gone into a few arguments with him. He's quite skeptical about the idea that computers of broadly the same kind of architectures as we have now could ever be conscious. But I like to joke, what I've slightly semi-jokingly, semi-seriously have said to him, you realize you're going to be on the wrong side of history. Even if you're right, that consciousness is essentially connected with life and metabolism, right? That's not the way the debate is going to evolve. Just because social AI is going to take over, metaphorically, it's going to get everywhere, and people are going to form relationships with AIs. And the idea that, people like you 30, 40 years ago were saying these things could never be conscious, it seemed monstrous to our grandkids, whether or not you're right or wrong. So I think that's a couple little interesting thoughts on biopsychism.
Interesting. And you use social AI in the sense that David used it earlier, right?
I think so. So basically, AI.
Yeah.
AI that elicits social emotions and attributions of mentality from users. So systems like Replica, and maybe even in a small way Alexa, but primarily applications that I'm thinking primarily of applications like Replica that are built primarily to fulfill social needs of users.
Right. Susan, you had a...
Oh, I have something to say. Yeah, Henry, it's interesting. You say wrong side of history. But I want to raise a kind of general, which is what is goal as scholars in this area. I mean, people are increasingly, going to be duped potentially by these chatbots. And, do we want history to unfold in that way, or do we see ourselves as, needing to play a role in clarifying these debates so that this doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So like, to what extent can or should the cog-sci world, the tech world, the philosophy world try to re-educate the public or steer the debate? I mean, I'm not sure how much we can do in the face of the massive commercial incentives to trick people, basically, or to elicit these kind of empathizing, mentalizing responses from users. Maybe we should be, standing athwart the track of history, saying stop, saying, don't treat these things as conscious. I'm not sure how successful academia is likely to be, but maybe we should be aiming for that.
So
keep momentum going. Maybe, maybe.
I was thinking, since I'm chairing the next session, and we now have under an hour for it, what I thought we would do is we'd take Chris and Steen's hands, and then allow Susan and Olaf and John to do their little, 3-minute session pitches, and then restart the conversation. This is a great conversation. It's exactly what we want to be having, but I want to make sure that we don't knock Susan, Olaf, and John too far down the track here. So does that make sense?
Perfect.
All right. So Chris, what were you going to say?
Well, I just thought I'd share a train of thought really along in this general space, which is that, when I first got interested in artificial life, and particularly in simulations, and I thought, well, is this real? Is whatever you learn from it, is it going to tell you anything real about real life? can you learn anything about real life? So I read quite a lot of Roger Penrose, who takes the view, and I think he's in a minority, but he takes the view that there is something in intelligence, and he uses as an example the way that mathematicians thinks. And he believes that an artificial intelligence system would never be capable of having the same kind of mathematical understanding that a real mathematician does. And he has all sorts of arguments of this, some sort of based on, I think some of it is based on Gödel's theorem, and also stuff down at the sort of micro level physics. So I had that on one side of it, but I also, my personal gut feel was that no, there isn't any fundamental distinction. And so I had as a sort of, I don't know, just a quote flying around in my mind that sort of illustrated it was, I think it was from Danny Hillis, who said, I think he said something along the lines of, I do not feel diminished by my kinship with Turing's machine. So anyway, that's just, I'll just chuck that into the mix, as it were.
Great. Yeah, those are interesting thoughts. And yeah, Penrose is an interesting perspective for sure. Steen or Steen, I'm not sure how you pronounce it.
Steen is good. So yeah, I'm sorry I wasn't able to participate in the first part of your session here, but I just want to re-emphasize what I said previously when we talked about ethics, when Olaf was giving his presentation about these issues. Here's my suggestion for where we could really make a difference. I think this community. Say we are much more focused on autonomy, understanding autonomy than the traditional AI community is. They are sort of their framework is different. So I think that when we want to talk about rights and responsibilities, there's a gazillion of questions that really begs answering, namely when our governments, our local municipalities, when they're using AI system, automated decision making, we have all these warfighting systems, these drones, etc. I mean, there's a gazillion of real world in your face issues that are changing how our reality is, that we could contribute with. And I don't want to take up too much time, but also I do think that one of the big issues, one of the big confusions is that because it's virtual, it's somehow not, I mean, virtual meaning that it's running on computers, then it's not real, which is of course complete bogus, because you need physical machines to support these physical processes that actually generates this automated decision making, et cetera, et cetera. So and how, if I just want to just conclude, because this is not just about these technological advances, it's just as much about what kind of social technology, what kind of laws and institutions we have. And there is a beautiful framework, legal framework we can lean up against to actually get ahead with this. And that is by simply stating, I mean, this is going to take a long way, that cyberspace should be a common good. It should be part of our commons, like clean water, access to roads, and there is this what's it called, public trust doctrine that has been governed. For instance, water is a public trust, power is a public trust, most places sewage is a public trust, and we should make cyberspace a public trust. If we do that, then suddenly, instead of having sort of say sick business models run with the development, we would actually have we could get cyberspace under democratic control. But this, in my opinion, this conversation is fragmented and confused. And I think that I hope that we could maybe help a little bit, but we should line up with. I mean, there's a lot of work going on. And my wife is a lawyer, and she's working on digital ethics with the Spanish government, and I mean, this is a way for AI, or sorry, for artificial life actually to go in and make contact in a real way. So that was my little spiel here.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I like this idea of internet or cyberspace as kind of a public good and a public trust. It's increasingly so central to our lives. Maybe not quite as central as water, but getting there. Right, and the connection between something's being virtual and something's being real. I don't know if you know, David Chalmers, a prominent philosopher, came out with a book that argues for exactly that the virtual is real. That's his book, Reality Plus. So if you're interested in that issue, you might want to check out that book, which is also very accessible.
Of course, it's real. I mean, that's why we here in the artificial life community, at least most of us believe that yes, since life is a process, physical process, and yes, you can have physical processes running in other materials than wet carbon chemistry, for instance, on computer networks. And I think most of us believe that yes, we have developed living processes on computers long time ago, and it's harder to do it in the test tube. I can tell you.
All right, let's get to our panelists. The second set of panelists finally. So we have Susan Schneider, who's a distinguished professor at Florida Atlantic University and director of a new center there I forget the name of your center, Susan, but you can introduce that. And her recent book, Artificial You, is super interesting. We've got John Basil, who's an associate professor of philosophy at Northeastern University, and he has also very interesting recent book called The Death of the Ethic of Life. And of course, Olaf, who I don't need to introduce to you folks now, is our third panelist. So maybe we could start with Susan giving a short kind of spiel.
Okay. So I'll just rant for a few minutes. There's so much to rant about in this area, right? But let me just start by mentioning that I think everything I'm going to say pertains to ALife as well. And we have to remember that the definition of life that a lot of people use, for example, the kind of official definition that NASA is using encompasses computation, right, in certain contexts, because it's just simply self-replicating and capable of Darwinian evolution. So, I'm going to kind of lump all these together. But I just wanted to mention, I'm writing another book, and the kind of machine consciousness that I'm thinking about now is very different than the kind of machine consciousness that is characteristically discussed. And I just wanted to call that to the issue to people's attention, because I'm working also with the intelligence community on sort of what's coming next. So maybe I'll just, since I have like 2 minutes, maybe I'll read you a paragraph from the book to kind of quickly give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about a sort of global Google brain as being the first super intelligence on the internet. So we'll be wired into it, we'll be part of it, which is kind of interesting philosophically. So, okay, I'm going to read you this. Here is an idea I find horrible yet hard to resist. We are already part of a computronium, the internet, a massive network that utilizes matter and energy throughout the globe for its computations. We are the sensory transducers delivering inputs into scores of machine learning algorithms. In the context of deep learning systems in particular, the data itself shapes the algorithm. Today's algorithms are but a disunified hodgepodge of fairly unintegrated programs. But over time, the disunified labyrinth, I hope I pronounced that right, of code may integrate in order to facilitate faster, higher bandwidth information transfer and communication between devices in the Internet of Things. Perhaps a single highly integrated system will emerge and be super intelligent, outperforming humans in every intellectual respect. The Internet Computronium is created by us, and it depends on us. Its shape is determined by market forces and internet regulations, regulations that may foster human flourishing or fail humans entirely, leaving us in a cyberpunk dystopia like the Borg in Star Trek. I've been drinking a lot when I write this. Okay, so that's my personal hell. That's what I'm working on. But what does this have to do with machine consciousness? Well, how are we going to recognize it if it's there I mean, we can't even in this context recognize the boundaries of a highly distributed system. I mean, you know, I think there'll actually be a number of what I call global brains, Chinese government, Chinese social media, these poor souls in China who will probably have involuntary brain implants and wearable technology tracking their every move, versus what Google will be up to and all these voluntary individuals who will be sharing their data like crazy. I mean, how are we going to recognize the demarcation of the boundaries of intelligent systems? That's the first issue that I'm grappling with, especially given the black box interpretability issues that we already see in the context of small systems that are spatiotemporally isolated. And then furthermore, given that we can't recognize the boundaries, how are we even going to run tests for consciousness or even talk about consciousness in a sensible way? I mean, right now, like just last week, I've been doing a lot of TV and radio with, you know, the usual circle of people talking about Google, what Google's doing. And like this Lambda system, right? The reaction to the Lambda system is absolutely ridiculous. So we've got a machine learning system that basically is an associative network. The brain could be this way. I mean, we know this from debates in philosophy of mind, right? And all of the quote experts are just going, oh, Lambda's definitely not conscious because it's just an associative system, blah, blah, blah. It's trained on experience. Well, I'm thinking to myself, you know, my intuition tells me that Lambda isn't conscious as well. But what are our grounds here? How are we justifying, like what reasoning are we providing? The quote experts in AI aren't providing any kind of decent rationale. The PR machine is a mess already. And I'm seeing a lot of anti-philosophical sentiment in these debates that's scaring me, by the way. Like a lot of, you know, what I call worry budget remarks, where people say machine consciousness isn't the problem or an issue that we should be talking about. We should be talking about algorithmic discrimination. That's the real issue. Someone said on a radio show I was on, consciousness is boring when we were talking about Lambda. Okay. So anyway, this, I think, crisis that we're already seeing is going to get worse as we develop distributed AI systems that we can't even recognize our systems. And we need to right now get out of the ivory tower and get involved, because there's issues that are going to affect our children and grandchildren. Okay, I'm done. I'm getting off my soapbox.
Thanks for that sunny optimism. All right, John.
Hi, everyone. So I don't have a carefully organized pitch. I'm just going to say a bunch of things I happen to think are true and have argued for elsewhere, and then we can pick up on that elsewhere. So, and mostly on this topic, not on just random things, I believe. I don't think being alive is a property that does any work in grounding moral status or rights. I think people are often confused about what that property even is, but I don't think it can do any real moral work. I also don't think we can draw a plausible distinction in moral status between artificially and naturally occurring systems. So the two things I've said so far sort of suggest that there's at least space for artificial life or synthetic organisms to have moral status. And I also think both sentient and non-sentient entities are capable of having interests or a welfare or a good of their own. And in fact, I think on the best account of non-sentient welfare, some multi-species collectives can have a welfare, though not things as big as ecosystems. They won't tend to. But here's where I start to draw a line with artificial life. I don't think the interests of non-sentient entities, artificial, naturally occurring, or whatever, ground moral status. And there's certainly, even if you think those interests sort of have some moral weight, the way we typically think about rights is rights are an especially strict moral constraint to protect really, really weighty interests. So they prevent us from just overriding interests for sort of utilitarian reasons. And certainly I don't think the interests of non-sentient entities are of sufficient strength to ground rights. So synthetic organisms, they're not ruled out from having moral status because they're synthetic or artificial. But until they have robust cognitive capacities, I think they are ruled out. They're not the kinds of, they're not subjects of moral concern. But a couple things, a couple nuances, like often we conflate discussions of moral status with settling questions of what our actual obligations are, but like the patterns of our obligations are determined by robust sorts of relationships and the way things are situated in our world. So there's lots of ways we can talk about what we owe to ecosystems and trees and synthetic life independently of whether they have rights themselves. And actually figuring out what our obligations are is a function of weeding through our social relationships to these technologies. When it comes to the conscious side of artificial systems, I think we, as people have brought up, there's lots of epistemic challenges to assessing cognitive capacities in artificial systems, both bottom up, like we don't have a great, I mean, I'm happy to be told otherwise, but I don't think we have really a great view about what the bases of consciousness are. And so it's going to be very hard to just tell whether a system's conscious by understanding what the bases are. And top down, like what have been mentioned before, our behavior and physiology, those are radically different. But a key piece of our making inferences about our own cognitive capacities or the cognitive capacities of other organisms is where they exist on the tree of life. The fact that I am so closely related to humans gives me some reason to take those behaviors and physiological features as evidence that they have capacities like mine. The further we get away on the tree of life, we get really challenging epistemic problems. This is why octopi are so challenging. I think it's not just that they are, I mean, it's essentially like they're aliens. So it's we can't tell whether their behaviors or their physiology ground the kinds of capacities we care about when we're thinking about moral status. And so I strongly, so despite all that, because of those epistemic challenges, even though I'm pretty skeptical about most artificial systems, I do pretty strongly favor developing some form of ethics oversight, because I think the ethical risk is pretty high. Once we create these things, we're very likely to torture them. That's probably true even if we could tell that they're conscious, just because we don't have the best track record. But it's especially likely because we're in a bad epistemic state. So I'll stop there.
Great. And Olaf, I'll give you the last stage here.
All right. Thank you, Susan and John. This is much to think about. This has been so helpful. I have so many notes so far. This is so fun. I wish we could do this every day. So to show my colors right away, I don't think embodiment is limiting per se. It does constrain some capacity. So I think in terms of conditions for existence of moral considerability, and I think of it almost mathematically. I think I mentioned something like Platonistic before. I think much along those lines. I think language, we should somehow design a language that is the only unambiguous version of this to talk about these concepts meaningfully, and it has to be somehow mathematical like, right? So I'm very liberal about this. I'm thinking of larger than life systems in general. My research is all about like diverse forms of life and intelligences. As Steve mentioned, right, the computational entities, those are real, right? And for me, they're very real. This is where I study, and those are physical. Those are, it's not, you know, it's not fluff. In Japan here, it's very funny. Software, it's not here, but it's where I usually live. Software is not considered like a thing. That's why software engineers are paid much less than in the rest of the world. What is paid very highly is if you deal with electronics, you're physicists, things that you can touch, right? So even in sort of progressive parts of the world, people think that way, but I think we are really pushing for the opposite. We are understanding that there are patterns that are not somehow tangible, like in the same way. Information is real. All right. So this is what ALife is. One of the main messages of ALife, and I think what I said earlier, right? To start with, like the ALife being larger than life ethics of artificial beings should be larger than human ethics per se. I think this is something I think is real, right? And I think this is the right place to have this conversation. So I'm glad we are having it. So what I care about is, well, okay. So about consciousness, since you guys mentioned about it, I'm very excited about consciousness studies. I guess Susan and I had chatted a lot in our Princeton/Manhattan days, and we've noticed the cruel conflicts between different communities. I'm very personally sympathetic with David, maybe surprisingly here, David's position the most, this empathetic position, social attribution. I think this is the closest to my own approaches. Maybe that's surprising, given what I just said about artificial systems being real. I think hybrid examples, maybe we can give some examples in our chat here, make it very concrete. Yeah, you mix up different types of biological artificial systems, and you see clear, I think. And this is a very impressive feat recently of artificial life, is that we are designing those kind of systems that mix things that you didn't think could be mixed. And things are not tools all of a sudden, they're part of an extension of the same mind stuff. All right, so yeah, maybe summarizing, I had some notes here of what I wanted to say. I didn't say any of that. All right, so yeah, I care a lot about, I guess, bringing this, the diverse intelligences stuff. So I'm involved in those kind of projects right now. And I think we can utilize really the tools of the ALife community to help go further in helping even applied ethics, right? Like bringing about new policies. The things that Steen said, I really think are true. And we can do it. We can better all life in the biosphere. Not only, I think making it clear for artificial beings makes the experimental approaches real, so we can actually make the policies for all beings clear and work. So yeah, I'm glad we're pushing for those reflections, and my hope is that we can maybe get I don't know, maybe a white paper, something together. Let's see where we get at the end of this chat.
Susan, one question that I had for you as a result of what you had said was the question, at one point you had said that we're going to voluntarily share our personal data with Google. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in that context is what counts as voluntary sharing of data, right? So one of the things that, you know, to kind of further the dystopian theme here, one of the things that I'm concerned about is, you know, as long as we have a competitive marketplace for labor, there are going to be strong incentives for people to sacrifice their information, their autonomy, their self-control to companies or organizations that can improve their ability to engage in productive labor. right? So it might seem voluntary in the sense that you click an end user license agreement or something like that, right? But it might not be in a practical sense voluntary to share our data or transform ourselves in certain ways if people feel like that's what they need to do in order to have the competitive edge they want or even maybe need in a labor market. So I was wondering if I could just kind of amp up your dystopianism a little bit there.
I agree entirely. I should have been more careful when I mentioned voluntary because, you know, a lot of this isn't truly voluntary. And we all click on very opaque user agreements, and we all needed to be here on Zoom or whatever we're on. So I like Steen's point about the internet. It should be a public trust. That would be such a good thing. I mean, I don't know what to do about the surveillance capitalist situation, right? I mean, I work with Congress and it's a mess. And they're all taking money from special interest groups, you know, and I think the situation as we move forward isn't going to get any better. Like I see a future of large scale unemployment due to technology I think it'll be hard for any of us to have jobs. So you might think, well, then we won't have a voluntary employment situation. We'll have something like universal basic income. But I'm not so sure there'll be a role for humans in that space. I mean, how do we know that we'll even get incomes? I think we have a lot of issues here that we need to consider as philosophers, right?
All right, Henry and then Steen.
Yeah, just since we're getting onto sort of automation type conversations, I guess one of the really big open questions for me looking at the next decade of AI research is whether sensory motor capacities of artificial systems improve to any significant degree. I mean, so far that's been sort of the situated robotics has been progressing dramatically more slowly than, for example, large language models and NLP. Susan, in answer to on the sort of automation point, I can see so many roles that we are a million years away from, well, not literally, but a very long way from automating. I mean, to give a simple example, rather than the Turing test, think about sort of a diaper test, right? Having a robot that you would trust to change your child's nappy, change your child's diaper without either hurting the child, getting poo everywhere, making a mess, etc. So I think the kinds of roles that humans may find that I think are going to be the last to be automated, at least if trends continue, are going to be the kind of more situated sensory motor things. Whereas, you know, actuarial services, legal services, design, maybe even coding, this is the stuff that's at risk. But I feel that the way things are going, there's still a distinctive niche for human intelligence. But as I say, next 10 years could be critical. Maybe we'll see similar advances in kind of situated robotics that we've seen in NLP over the last few years there.
Yeah, and remember, the super intelligent AIs will redesign the robots. But I do agree in the more short term. Yeah.
I like everyone's optimism that we're going to solve the climate problem and get to a different dystopia.
Well, maybe the AI will solve it for us. I mean, that was always Kurzweil's hope.
If you let me out of the box, I'll solve climate change for you.
Steve.
Yeah, so I think that to get back to sort of our ideas of this public trust, before I mean, we should look at history. This is sort of my that's the way I can find optimism. Even though we've messed up, the history of humanity is messing up a lot of things, we somehow managed to maneuver so that you know, some level of good stuff has happened. I mean, I view this our time here is being in some ways similar to the transition where we went from all being farmers to going into the industrial era. And as you know, back then there was some horrible social construction. I mean, social technologies. Since there was not enough work at the farms, these farmhands, they went in to work in the factories. Nobody asked them to do so, but the factory owners, they said, well, you guys you want to work here, you have to work for 12 hours. Your kids have to work there too. But over the years, and lots of people got hurt in the process, that got changed. And I think that we are in a similar situation. I mean, there are not as many dead bodies on the table, but still, we are doing horrible things to ourselves and to our environment. But before we can actually change things, there has to be a vision. There has to be a narrative that makes sense. Something that we can make our own and say, yeah, this is actually something that gives us hope. And we can see that there might be light if we go in that direction. And I think that this community also is too much focused on the devices, on the technology, on these physical technologies. Whereas what we really have to focus on too is are all these ways by which we organize ourselves to pursue our goals. Because I mean, these social technologies, because they are also autonomous, they are self-reproducing, they evolve and change over time. So I guess what I'm sort of saying is I support that all of that. We should try to write a white paper, and I would say we are in the process of writing a white paper about this public trust, anyways. And I think that this public trust idea is not our. It's just that we've sort of adopted it. It was tested in the Supreme Court in Oregon, where there was a group that tried to bring to court that the atmosphere was a public trust or is a public trust. But the judge said, well, it's not that I can't see the arguments for this, but at this point in time, I don't think that there is, so to say, public support for that. So it is a matter of, and how can we change that? Well, we have to change the narratives. And how can we change narratives? There has to be some kind of believable way through, and finding this trajectory, formulating this trajectory, I think is to a great extent on us. I mean, we are, whether we like it or not, we are intellectuals. And we're being paid to think about things that most people don't have the luxury to really reflect on. I'm sorry, it was sort of a long rant, but I think yes, let's try to write a sort of a white paper on this, and also let's please focus. Let's put some of our effort into focusing on these social technologies too, because they are paramount. We have to change those, because else we get into Susan's dystopias where we all become part of these large. I mean, these large corporations, small robots. Thank you.
Before we get to John's hand, maybe I just encourage anybody who's interested in this white paper idea to email Olaf, who can then organize a white paper group. Yeah, John.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. So for those interested in the white paper, there's already some work being done by Josh Simons at Harvard in collaboration with Omidyar and some others on developing a view about technologies as public infrastructure. So definitely take a Google at that. I can try to send it around. I mean, this is related to questions about like how solvable not only like these public infrastructure problems are, but just general problems in making sure we treat whatever AI consciousness we create well. Like I'm actually skeptical. I think looking at history provides us some reason to be skeptical that we'll solve these problems. And that's because historically, when we've developed ethics infrastructure to solve a problem, it's because some event has occurred that we've taken to be so problematic that we sort of all of a sudden the government is like, okay, let's get people together. Let's write the Belmont report. Let's instantiate human subjects oversight. people found out their dogs were being kidnapped and sold to experiment farms. They band together and the government said, okay, we're going to regulate animal subjects research. It's not, given the things that are already being done by the tech companies and the harms they're causing, it's not clear what kind of event could possibly happen that would do that if it hasn't already. I mean, we've already seen massive undermining of democratic institutions. And also it has all the features of what, so if people know Stephen Gardner's work on climate ethics, he says one of the reasons, part of the, he calls it the perfect moral storm, like the harms of climate change are such that they sort of push all the right buttons for us to not do anything. Like the main subjects of harm are not directly related. They're like for future people. It's a collective action problem. It's got these features of collective action problems that are especially hard to solve. And these problems seem to me to have those features as well. So like these don't have the features of the problems historically we've gotten together to resolve. So I'm pretty skeptical not to promote the dystopian view of things, but.
Can I ask a question of the audience? Okay, since you're all here, all right. Curious. So I want to try to solve some of these problems that I raised, and I'm wondering if anybody knows how to deal with this system demarcation problem that I mentioned. So, there's a literature on collective intelligence, for example. I mean, were there authors that ever explained how you demarcate the boundaries of these collective systems?
Oh, Eric, you've written a lot on this.
Oh,
Data conscious and also various awesome alien collectives.
Yeah, I have written some on that, although I've tended to not take a stand on how exactly you define the line between where the boundaries of a collective are, which I think is a big question. But one of the things that I think is true, and which is my emphasis in thinking about collective minds, is that if you just take out of the box what lots of philosophers and consciousness researchers say about what constitutes a mind or what the grounds of consciousness are, and you just apply it out of the box to science fictional entities or even a real entity like the United States considered as a concrete entity, then you kind of end up with these unintuitive conclusions that, oh, these things have minds, these things are conscious, these things maybe deserve moral consideration. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'll have to review all that. I know that would, it'll probably be useful to reread those papers. Yeah, the demarcation thing, I don't know what to do about it.
Susan, I'll just point you. So like there's lots of philosophers of biology that work on defining what species are, but that's like kind of a relatively, I think, easy problem compared to what counts as a population. Like everyone defines selection as a force that acts on a population, but almost nobody says what delineates populations except for a few people. So you might look at Roberta Milstein's stuff trying to say like, what kind of tools can we use to draw boundaries around populations? And maybe there will be something there. I haven't looked at it in light of this, but it's a useful sort of analog. It's not quite the same boundary problem, but might be helpful.
Thank you. That's great.
Chris and then Henry.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick thought on this question of boundaries. I mean, if you look at any system, you can usually represent it in some way as a network. So I'm thinking that where you see a network and it's got particular nodes with lots and lots of links to them, and you get clusters as well. Those are big. I think those may be beginning to identify what the things are. What are the chunks of, what are the coherent sort of clumps of things. So, and there are algorithms that can do this. There are algorithms for identifying clusters. So that's what I would say about that. It's really about looking at it as a network and where are the clusters in the network.
I would love it if you'd put in the chat the names of those algorithms to identify clusters. That would be great.
There's one. Okay, I'll have a look. I think there's one called K-means, but I'll see if I can put more in. But one
I appreciate that. I mean, I guess what I'm worried about is that if you have a kind of Google brain, if you will, it's not like the entire internet is part of a global mind, if you will. It's a subsystem, and the problem is to define just that subsystem and to productively know when there is an actual super intelligence. Like sometimes I joke around, well, maybe if IIT was actually computable, we could look for clusters of, integrated information on the web. I mean, it's really like almost an issue for cybersecurity, how you define and identify a super intelligent system when it's spatiotemporally scattered and has access to the entire internet, but is really only a part of the internet.
Henry, did you want to pitch in on this?
Yeah, so sort of a recommendation for Susan is that the first thing, just it may seem not immediately relevant, but I think there's some really good literature on split brain patients, and particularly Lizzie Schechter's recent book on split brains, I think has so much interesting stuff on how you demarcate psychological subjects. She ultimately comes to the view that in some sense the two hemispheres are psychologically distinct subjects. It's a really interesting position. Tim Bain has also, I don't think he's got a paper on it yet, but he's been, he gave a great talk at the ASSC this year where he talked about, let me get the term right, hemispherotomy, which is distinct from
Hemispherectomy. Yeah.
Right, so yeah, exactly. So with hemispherotomy, but not ectomy, the other hemisphere is left intact, but is severed from its connection to the other hemisphere. And he raises this really dark specter that perhaps this other hemisphere is kind of along for the ride, but has no real agency anymore. Anyway, so there's
being John Malkovich.
Exactly being John Malkovich. So anyway, that's just a suggestion of literature. I also wanted just to pick up on something, Eric, you said, another little tidbit from the ASSC this year. So Stanislas Dehaene, who is, I think, one of the preeminent figures in consciousness science, the founder of modern global neuronal workspace theory, building on Bernie Barr's view, he came out and said, I think it shocked almost everyone. He said, basically, yeah, if you had a car and you had all the sensors hooked up into a single centralized system, such that your car navigation computer would know when you're running out of petrol, that would be conscious, sure. So I think, I'm regularly, I think there is a problem, and I think this is what I was picking up on, Eric, in relation to your point. I think there is a pervasive sort of trivial realization problem in a lot of science of consciousness, a lot of theories of consciousness, where it's easy to think of how you could instantiate a system that satisfies any given theory of consciousness, using existing off-the-shelf tech in a weekend. So these kind of gerrymandered cases, I think, are a real problem for a lot of the theories of consciousness.
Yeah.
I like that name, trivial realization problem. Although it does borrow from our antecedent intuitions about what is conscious, and we don't really have a justification for our judgments, and that worries me.
Right, yeah, so it's tricky. So although I like Eric's line on this, I'm more sure that a series of a handful of logic gates is not conscious than I am that any clever philosophical argument to the contrary is correct. Something like that, Eric, from your Garden Snell paper.
Yeah.
Susan,
go on, sorry.
Go ahead, Henry.
Well, I mean, I think that was basically it. Go on, sorry.
I mean, it almost seems though in that case like logic gates are abstract entities, and it's easier to see that something acausal, non-spatiotemporal, et cetera, isn't conscious.
I was just going to say, I mean, there is this well, in the AI safety community or the super intelligent community, they tend to be very deflationist about consciousness, or they conflate planning agents with conscious agents because they can do the same thing. But I also think that we're in a bad place to argue for like a particular subvenient base for consciousness. But at the same time, it seems extremely plausible to me that it's got a sort of qualitative component. Now I can't tell when another thing has that, but it seems extremely plausible to me that you have to at least think that that's just saying it sort of has these, it can operate like a planning or a strategic agent isn't sufficient to show that it's got that qualitative component.
think there's a lot of very exciting futuristic ideas, and there are now we should think about this because we have to fix things ideas. So talking about the internet, I think there are different aspects of security, networks, collective minds, and so on that we're talking about now. And those are a bit of both. So in the security part, like, we have to fix now. I think anything metaverse, social tech that we mentioned, that Steen also mentioned, right? This has to be fixed now. It's going to go very wrong, right? So this has so much power, and this is governed by main companies that I won't even name. This is and the choices that they have been making are awful. And I feel like maybe it's our roles as intellectuals to do that, like Steen said. We don't have power directly, right? But we can at least make things very clear for them to, or for people to see how wrong it's going. So that's for now. And for the future, I guess metaverse means that you also have agents there. You have a lot of bots on Twitter. I don't know if you guys are active there, but most of my research in AI happens on Twitter nowadays because we don't have time to go attend the conference. The paper was out a year ago. So everything is happening on a daily basis, right? And a lot of the posts now are by bots, and we have to be very careful. You don't know who they are. They post with a very human-like language. Those persona are, as far as I'm concerned, on a daily basis, as real as you and me. And we need to have policies about what that means. If Susan, you talked a lot about mind upload in the past, right? This is the next step. But right now we already have those persona. How do we deal with that as well? So that's the futuristic side. But I think all the metaverse issues require some kind of addressing in terms of ethics.
I want to make one comment about the regulation thing, and then I want to give Steen his hand, and then Olaf will get the last 5 minutes to kind of sum things up and maybe talk about future directions. So the regulatory thing I wanted to just mention is my experience. I was involved briefly with the autonomous vehicle debate about the regulation for autonomous vehicles in California, because the California Department of Motor Vehicles was considering what kinds of safety regulations should be in place for autonomous vehicles. And Google said, we should self-regulate. There should not be any interference by the public in our own self-regulation of safety. And if you don't agree, we're going to go to Texas. And they won that debate, basically. So.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So that's the kind of mentality we're dealing with. Okay, Steen.
Oh, you're muted, I think, Steen.
Oh yeah, unmute Steen, please.
So I'm sorry. Yeah. I mean, it's really scary. I mean, each country or part of the world has different challenges, and it seems like you guys have. I mean, the number one and number two and number three is you have to make it illegal to contribute for corporations to contribute to elections. I mean, the way that America unfortunately sort of slipped into legalizing corruption is really horrifying. I mean, my 3 adult kids are over there, and I may move back. I mean, so that's number 1, 2, or 3. But I still think that we can. I mean, there has to be. There seems to be no way out. When I talk to people, when we interact, people say, "But what can I do?" Well, providing a vision so that there is there's hope. That's number 1. I mean, that's what we can do, and I think that this is something that this community can participate in a little bit. So providing viable solutions. I mean, thoughtful solutions, and then we have to, I guess, collaborate with the artists to get the story out there so it becomes understandable and consumable, or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, so yes, I mean, I've also been on a variety of committees on these issues here, and in the end, my wife said that I had to stop because there was too much trouble in my head because of the frustration. So I think that we cannot. I mean, I don't know. I'm certainly not a politician. I'm terrible at it because I speak too much my mind. But what we could do is again to provide viable trajectories instead of focusing on the dystopias. Let's make solutions.
All right, so that concludes this part of the session, and then we'll just have some final words from Olaf.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining this and for so many ideas. I have so many notes. I also recorded this. I shared the recording or the transcript rather. That's usually more helpful. Okay, so one practical thing is that I have at hand a few opportunities for funding this, if that's of interest for some of us. Please email me. I should probably copy paste again my email that was buried in the chat. Yeah, so please email me if you are interested. There are a couple of lines I see for this, and we should probably chat about that. It can be over email first. There are at least 2 private sources of funding and maybe a couple of public as well. I didn't think of governmental sources, but I feel like maybe Susan or others as team, you definitely have some advice. I'd welcome that. I think there is a lot that we can do in combination between our communities here. And it's also a responsibility. We talked a little bit less about the sort of responsibility as people creating life forms, which is an important problem as well. And people were interested. Also exobiology kind of rights. People mentioned that because they are from astrobiology and that kind of field from yesterday. So that's maybe a side thing. I think I'd like from you, yeah. So if you are interested, please just email me. And I guess if you know other people who would be great to join, I see a few names here. Joanna is actually already part of this community. So I think she mentioned to me that she would be very happy to join the group for the project. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining at a crazy time of the day. I really appreciate it, Eric too. And yeah, let's keep chatting. Eric, anything to add?
No, I think that's great. So Olaf, thanks for bringing this all together and organizing a wonderful session. And thanks to all the contributors in the audience. I think this has been very interesting and productive.